Thank you, Mika? I love the red shoes.
Well, I'm half French, half American, so I'm supposed to have red shoes by nature, right? Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me today. I'm not Alaskan, so I'm glad that non-Alaskan people can also talk at the Arctic Encounter Symposium. And I would like to thank Alice very much because thanks to her and President Grimson, actually Rachel had the opportunity to spot us and our research at the latest Arctic Circle conference, so thank you too. Well, I'm not going to teach you this. This is 2015, right? Can I take you back in time for a second? 20 years ago, so 1995, my father offered me my first computer. So its operating system was basically Windows 3.1. I used to have video games, you know, on these little IBM flash drives of 1.44 megabytes. Well, that was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the euro did not exist. Finland, Sweden were not even part of the EU. They were just joining the EU in 1995. There was no tunnel back then between London and Paris. It was just built at the end of 1995. Nunavut did not exist. The Greenlandic self-government did not exist. Kim Kardashian, Gordon Ramsay, all these people did not exist. The Spice Girls did not exist. Well, they did, but you know what I mean. Back then, China and India were not part of the world's 10 largest economies. We were only 5 billion people then. I was 6, so I was one of the youngest. But right now, we are more than 7 billion on Earth. The world's average primary energy consumption per capita was 19,000 kilowatt per hour. Now, in 2014, well, if you allow me this digression a little bit, it was around 25,000 kilowatt per hour. In 2031, it will be 32,000 kilowatt per hour. Between 1995 and 2010, dozens of trillions of dollars have been invested in air, land, and sea infrastructure. It was a G1 world back then. It was an American world. Right now, we are in the G0 world. As you know, China is now the world's largest economy. So we're here today to talk about the Arctic, but I had to make this introduction because at POLARISK what we do is what Americans call actually predictive analysis. So our analytical time frame is the year 2035. We are the only consultancy in the world right now working with a pan-Arctic and a double Arctic-Antarctic perspective on polar affairs. And so what are we going to be talking today is, well, I mean, put it this way. Let's avoid the Fukuyama syndrome. What I call the Fukuyama syndrome is basically thinking that in 2015 we are at the end of history. We're definitely not at the end of history, and that's exactly what Edward Eda said this morning. It was fantastic speech. And in 2035, the world will be just as different from 2015 as 2015 is different from what the world was in 1995. In 2035, so we'll be 8 to 9 billion humans. Each and every one of us will consume a lot of energy, I've mentioned it. We'll take the world's GDP from $81 trillion to $210 trillion, depending on the estimates. That's an average estimate, sorry. In the Arctic, we'll take what we call the gap at POLARISK, the gross Arctic product, from $620 billion to $2.1 trillion on 20 years. Of course, this is based on 2010 US dollar purchasing power parity, if you want to get into the details of our studies. And at current trends, China's annual military expenditure will match that of the US in 2035. In 2016, so next year, it's going to be only half of the US total military expenditure. Last week, the Beijing municipal government announced that it would pay for the so-called New Silk Road, you know, this train line connecting Beijing to Moscow. The estimated bill is 242 billion USD, and the journey would take 48 hours. Okay, fantastic. A few analysts, especially those in DC, have said that, well, this New Silk Road train line would actually hinder the development of the Northern Sea route or the Northeast Passage. Actually, what we see is that it's not going to happen. These two different routes will generate their own markets, first of all, and the two markets will be complementary, but the two markets will actually fuel each other. So that's an interesting thing when we talk about the Arctic. At the same time, so last week, America was still debating whether or not to order new icebreakers and to deal in the coastal plain of Alaska. That's interesting because that's a discussion that started back in 1995 when President Clinton vetoed the GOP bill back then. So is America falling behind in the Arctic? Well, not exactly. Not exactly. The problem is, when considering the plans that America's allies and contenders have for the Arctic, it's easy to figure out that the coming 2 years are make or break years for the US in the Arctic. And I'm sure that Alice will be maybe tackling on that issue. So the US won't chair the Arctic Council again until 2031. So back then, when it happens, 2031, it will be too late to drive any kind of change then. When the US assumed the Arctic Council's chairmanship again for the 2031-2033 period, we will have already entered the Arctic booming era then. And so what will happen to America in the Arctic? Well, it's fairly easy to imagine what are going to be the Arctic geoeconomics in 2035. When we think about the Arctic will see two kinds of structural development phases. The first one is the Arctic construction era, and the second one, starting 2030 or so, will be the Arctic booming era. So the Arctic construction era for a second. So it's a phase, the phase that we've been in since 1995 or 1990s, since the Berlin Wall fell, if you want. Many things have been built in the Arctic. When I mean things, I mean institutions, the Arctic Council, the Northern Forum, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Eurobarents, the Arctic Economic Council, Norwegian North Council, so many institutions. You have macro-social constructions as well. Where is the Arctic? What is the Arctic? Who is the Arctic? South to north dynamics versus circumpolar approaches. Subarctic versus near-Arctic. Arctic branding, gateway cities, all these kind of things are things that were constructed in the past 20 years. You also have micro-social constructions. So food security, health, sanitation issues, housing, education, and so on and so forth. You also have ethical constructions. For example, last year, the hashtag hunt seal, wear seal, eat seal was a big thing in American policy because a lot of people were random people were just discovering what the Arctic life was. Of course, when it comes to ethical constructions, Mead mentioned it, the N-war issue, of course, is one. You can find also the mass labor imports management issues in Greenland, for example, large-scale tourism. Well, beyond that, you also have regulation building. So, of course, the continental shelf extensions, the delimitation of Arctic regions within the Arctic countries, ENP permits, specific Arctic regulations and requirements such as the Polar Code that was discussed this morning, Arctic Ready standard certification programs, and so on and so forth. These are all soft infrastructure building. They require investing time and money in policymaking, in diplomacy and stakeholder management and engagement, and in general science. And then we have hard infrastructure, the core topic of our session right now. So in the Arctic, we would need energy plants, energy grids, port terminals, airports, communications, cities, hospitals, water networks, you name it. And so what's interesting is that hard infrastructures require political will, first of all, effective and attractive investment vehicles to make it happen, and target science programs aimed at research and development, on the one hand for market predictability, so that's what we do, and for product research development specific to the Arctic on the other hand. That's what we don't do, right? So right now I'm not going to be talking about voter groups, just schools of thought in international relations. So functionalist and neo-institutionalists, liberals, as we call them in IR, they argue that soft infrastructure building and economic demand are a prerequisite to hard infrastructure building. They claim that Arctic investments in hard infrastructure cannot be sustainable if they are not grounded within a favorable Arctic institutional framework first, and if they don't respond to a pre-existing or emerging demand second. At POLARISK, we come from the constructivist school of thought. What that means is that our argument is that investment in polar hard infrastructure actually drives polar soft infrastructure building. So what that means is the following. We argue that when a market transitions from frontier market status, like the Arctic or the Antarctic today, to post-frontier market or even emerging market status, concepts such as institutional frameworks and demand are socially constructed phenomena driven by the market's own needs. And so we argue that these socially constructed phenomena are driven by hard infrastructure requirements rather than by soft infrastructure ones. So let me rephrase this if this is not clear. It is political will and investments in market predictability and in research and development that can turn a frontier market into an emerging market. So a very straightforward contemporary evidence to support such claim, you can ask me, well, Antarctica is one, but maybe I should save that to another conference. In the Arctic, many territorially grounded evidences support our claim. Well, the Alaska's North Slope is one. And today, Yamal, Greenland, Yakutia, Lapland, Iceland, and even some non-subarctic territories like Maine, Scotland, France's Normandy region, Poland, South Korea, even Singapore fall into that category. So functionalists and neo-institutionalists will argue, okay, so how do you explain the interest of so many states for a seat as observer at the Arctic Council? Well, the answer is quite simple. It is precisely because there is political will at home and an emerging or existing demand to go Arctic from home. For instance, when Singapore, India, South Korea, and Japan applied to become observers, they sought market predictability information. Now that they have gained access to the Arctic Council, so now that they accessed the information and some kind of Arctic respectability, they are developing very effective stakeholder engagement strategies to support their geo-economic agenda in the Arctic, or for some like China or Russia, their geostrategic agenda as well. So conversely to what some think tanks like CSIS or The Economists could argue, The Economist is not a think tank, granted, but you get the idea. At the circumpolar level, these two structural phases, so the construction and the booming eras, are not impacted by conjectural issues such as short-term prices or Russian sanctions. Put differently, if Western investors wanted to stop investing in the Russian or Canadian Arctic, well, that doesn't mean that Chinese, South Korean, or even Indian investors would stop doing that too. So that said, with all that said, what is to expect from the US Arctic Council chairmanship? How does this short 2 years fall into this structural analysis? Well, it's simple. I'm going to go fast. If the US Arctic Council's chairmanship can have an impact, if it can chart a path towards a sustainable Arctic development, well, the US, if they want to achieve that, they have to focus on accelerating the building of the Arctic superstructure rather than managing conjectural issues or solely focus on developing the Arctic Council as an institution or as a standalone institution. So said differently, the US Arctic policy must have a vision that goes beyond institutionalism, and I'm going back to Mead's point earlier. It must focus on the long term rather than being polluted by short-term economics or politics. I'm not a diplomat, so I can argue that the Canadian chairmanship was polluted by such things. The US Arctic policy must be resilient, if you will. Stick to the vision, right? So for the 2017-2019 period, as you know, Finland will adopt a very strongly business-oriented agenda so as to impulse change in the Arctic, in its own Arctic, but across the Arctic. And I don't know if you know that, but Finland already brands itself as the only Arctic territory, the only Arctic country whose territory, the whole of it, is north of the 60 degrees parallel. Well, actually, it's not true, because if Greenland is a country, they also have that. If Iceland is a country, and I think it is, they are also above the 60th degree. But it's a matter of branding here. And if the Prime Minister Alexander Stubb, wants to make of Finland, of the Arctic, Finland's innovation hub, and of Finland, the Arctic's innovation hub, well, that's going to be made easier because, as you may not know, or know, I don't know, the former Prime Minister from Finland, Jyrki Katainen, is actually right now the EU Commission's Vice President responsible for economic affairs. And as this morning, Finland is, the EU will adopt an economic Arctic strategy, a comprehensive Arctic strategy, in December 2015. So all these issues are kind of entrenched, right? So the US must get away from the typical DC drama, we've said it, and adopt Finland's approach. The US and Alaska must offer a vision for the Arctic if they really want to proactively drive the change in the Arctic instead of watching passively contenders gain Arctic market share and diplomatic influence every day. So it's not going to be an easy task because big picture economics for the 2 years to come are actually not that good. So frankly, firstly, because the Chinese bubble has entered a correction phase this past 18 months, the global trade flows have slowed down. And secondly, because of geopolitical factors that traders and investors fail to address predictively, well, they end up caught into market panic movements. We could talk about Greece, the Greek issue within the EU. There are many other political issues that could pollute, as we said, the Arctic Council's chairmanship. But when it comes to oil and gas, especially oil prices, America must be very vigilant. It's not because oil prices have gotten down to $40 or $60 a barrel that there won't be a demand for going into the Arctic. At POLARISK, what we know, what we figure out is that at least 55% of all existing or planned hydrocarbon projects in the Arctic will go forward these two coming years. Companies such as Shell, Eni, Statoil, Rosneft, Gazprom, Lukoil, CNPC, PetroChina, Sinopec, Total, Novatek, PetroVietnam, Imperial, and Lundin will move forward in the Arctic this year alone. So I don't want to get into the ANWR debate. I think that many other people can do it better than I do as a French-American type of guy. But what I just want to say here is that we have to keep in mind that between $450 billion to $1.1 trillion worth of Alaskan extractable resources over 35 years would have to remain underground should the coastal plain remain off access to drilling. We can develop that figure and the rationales of that figure, of those figures later during the questions. So make no mistakes, fluctuations in terms of the interest in the Arctic market depends also and primarily on fluctuations of the Arctic Ocean's minimum sea ice extent, and I will conclude on that. In this regard, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, so a group of international academics with links to Cambridge University, University of Ottawa, and many others, have published a paper this week. And they've said that there is a 20% probability that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free during the summer of 2015. 20% probability. And there is, according to them, a 70% probability that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2020. In a 2012 document, the US Navy expected the Arctic Ocean to be ice-free during the summer of 2016, as you know. And NASA expects it to happen by 2035. Actually, there is a consensus on 2035 among the scientific community with regards to a sea ice-free Arctic. So in 2035, I'll be 46, right? So most of our partners and analysts at POLARISK will be in their early 50s or mid-50s. So we will all be then dependent on the strategies that would have been taken today. So I just wanted to mention that because between 2015 and 2017, all Arctic stakeholders, companies, countries, everyone will actually adjust their own strategies after the American one, after what America has done as chair of the Arctic Council. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope we can continue discussion during the questions.